In this video, we are going to take a look at how to upgrade SDKs, Kotlin, and Gradle versions in our Flutter app. We will be using the following versions of Android Studio and Flutter, and we will be upgrading these versions of Kotlin and Gradle. The first method we will look at is what I call the sequential or prompted upgrading. Let's say we've now got a new project, and we go into our pubspec.yaml file to add a new plugin package. Now we click on the pub get, followed by running the main.dart. We've now gotten a build fail error, as our newly added package requires a higher min SDK than what we've got set in our Flutter project. So let's fix this by going into our app-level build.gradle file, updating our min SDK version to the version we were prompted, and run main.dart again. Now we've gotten a new error, that our Kotlin version is lower than the version required by our added package. In the older version of Flutter, we'd fix this by going into the Android-level build.gradle file, where the Gradle version and the Kotlin version were in the build script at the top. With the current version of Flutter, the Gradle and Kotlin versions are in the settings.gradle file. So let's update the Kotlin version here to the version we've been prompted in the error message and run our main.dart again. And this time, our build is successful with no error prompts. This is good news, right? My standard practice, whenever I add a new plugin package, is to open the Android module to let the Gradle build run. This is to avoid any unnecessary stress at the end of your project. We now have a successful build, but we are shown a strong recommendation to update our Gradle plugin version, though it doesn't suggest which version. To know which version to upgrade to, we go to the Android developer's website. We click on Minimum Versions of Tools for Android API level, and we can now see that the minimum Gradle plugin version we require for our API level 34 is version 8.1.1. So let's go back into our settings.gradle file, update it with the Gradle plugin version we found, and run main.dart again. This time, we are presented with an error, that our Gradle wrapper needs to be updated to a specified version to match our updated Gradle plugin version. At this point, we'd go into our Android Gradle wrapper folder and open the Gradle-wrapper.properties file. And here we can update the Gradle version that we've been suggested. So this gives you an idea of how the sequential or prompted upgrading method works. You basically go through each step and follow the prompts on what needs to change. Let's undo our Kotlin and Gradle plugin version updates and get started on the second method, which is the preemptive or latest versions upgrading method. Every time I get started on a new project, the first thing I do is to go into the IDE and project settings and click on project structure. I then set the project SDK version, which in this case is Android API 34. I then continue to set the module SDK versions to the same Android API level 34. I'm sure you're wondering why I've chosen the API level 34, or trying to understand what level you should be using. For that, I simply go to the Android developer's website, which shows you the minimum target API level, which currently shows as API level 33. And if you look at Google's support for Google Play Console, you can see that the new target API levels are updated every year on August 31st. And since I've always preferred to stay ahead, I've chosen to go with API level 34 in my new projects. Now we can go back to Android Studio and go into our Android level settings.gradle file, where we have our Gradle plugin version and Kotlin version. To find these, I just go to the Android developer's website for Gradle plugin releases and click on Update the Android Gradle plugin. We now have the Gradle plugin and Kotlin versions. So let's update these versions to our project. Go back to the Android developer's website and this time click on the Update Gradle, which will show you the Gradle version for your Gradle plugin. You can now use this to update your wrapper. An alternative way to find the Gradle wrapper version which I prefer, is just to run main.dart just with the Gradle plugin version updated. When the build fails, we are shown the full file name for the Gradle wrapper, which we can use safely. With that done, let's run our main.dart and see if everything is all good now. Although this does build successfully, let's take a look at the warning messages we still got. We have an NDK version warning now. So let's go into the app level build.gradle file and update that NDK version. Now that's done, but if we're being preemptive, where would we find this NDK version in the first place? For that, we simply go to the Android developer's website for the Gradle plugin, click on Compatibility, and you can find the NDK version required for your Gradle version. So this outlines the process of being preemptive and using the latest versions for your Kotlin, Gradle plugin, and Gradle versions by sourcing the information from the Android developer websites. Now we will again reset all the version updates we've done and have a look at the third method, which is using the Android Gradle plugin upgrade assistant. Since the AGP upgrade assistant only upgrades the Gradle plugin and Gradle versions, we would still have to update the Kotlin version ourselves. In the previous example, we went to the Android developer's website to find the Kotlin version, but this time we will go to the Kotlin website. We can find the latest version under release details. After we've updated the Kotlin version in our settings.gradle file, we can open the Android module as a separate window in Android Studio. When the Android module has completed loading, go into Tools, then select AGP Upgrade Assistant. The Upgrade Assistant recommends the version to upgrade to. Ensure the checkbox is selected for the version upgrade and click Run Selected Steps. The Android plugin has now been upgraded successfully, and we get a recommendation to test that everything is working. So let's go back into our Flutter project window, where we can see that the Gradle plugin version has been updated, and we can run main.dart. Looks like the upgrade has gone well. Let's now go back to the AGP upgrade assistant and hit refresh. We can now see our current Gradle plugin version, which is 7.4.2, and the newest Gradle plugin version we can upgrade to, which is 8.3.2. This version is even higher than what we had seen on the Android developer's website, which was 8.3.0. So let's upgrade to the latest version available by scrolling up in the drop-down box and again clicking Run Selected Steps. The AGP upgrade has now completed successfully, and we can see our Gradle plugin has been updated to version 8.3.2, and also our Gradle version has been updated to version 8.4. If you now went back to hit refresh again, you can see that your current version is up to date, and no suggestions that there are newer versions. We can now go back to our Flutter project, into our settings.gradle file, and confirm that our Gradle plugin version is showing as 8.3.2. Next, we go into our Gradle wrapper.properties file and confirm that the Gradle plugin is showing version 8.4. As those all seem okay, let's run our main.dart to be sure everything's working as it should. So we got the NDK version warning, as we did in previous methods, as this doesn't get updated with the AGP update assistant, just like the Kotlin version, but it still builds successfully. So this concludes the method of using the AGP upgrade assistant. It is definitely the easiest method to get the latest versions of the Gradle plugin and the Gradle wrapper for your project. The methods we've seen so far are within Android Studio and has to be done at the start of every new project. So what if you wanted to change the Flutter files themselves so it is always applied? I can now show you the files within the Flutter directory that would need to change for this. However, this is a very fiddly and risky method, and I would not recommend anyone to do it this way. In the previous version of Flutter, from your Flutter directory, you'd go to Packages, Flutter Tools, Gradle, and open the flutter.gradle file. This used to be where you could amend the versions applied to your Flutter projects. In the current version of Flutter, you'll first have to go further into the src, then main, then Groovy directory, and open the flutter.groovy file. As you scroll down, you'll find your compile SDK version, min SDK version, target SDK version, and your NDK version. Just above them, you'd find a comment that these versions need to match the values in another file called gradleutils.dart. As you scroll lower, you'd find the Gradle Plugin version, and also the comment that this version needs to match the gradleutils.dart file, and also a build.gradle.kts file. So let's first take a look at the build.gradle.kts file, which is within the Flutter, then Packages, then Flutter Tools, then Gradle directory. This has the Gradle Plugin version, and also the same comments about needing versions in different files to match. Let's now go into the last file, the gradleutils.dart file, which is within the Flutter, Packages, Flutter Tools, lib, src, then Android folder. Here we have everything we need for a project: the Gradle and Gradle plugin versions, the compile SDK, min SDK, target SDK, and the NDK versions. But we also see a comment above both the sections to see the README file before making any changes. So let's go have a look at the README file. And here we see a whole list of criteria for each type of the versions you wish to change in the Flutter folder. And this is why I would not recommend this method. Since we've covered many different methods and sources in this video, let's just do a quick summary of what I believe to be the best sequence for all the upgradable versions. For the min SDK, I'd advise to use the prompted method of upgrading, because you want it to be as low a version as will be allowed by your project, so only upgrade it if a package requires it. For the compile and target SDK, I would visit the Android developer website that shows the minimum target API level at the current time, or the next version above the minimum. For the NDK version, I would visit the Android developer website for the Gradle plugin. The NDK should not change as often, so you could also wait till you're prompted to make this upgrade. For the Kotlin version, I'd visit the Kotlin website to find the latest release. And finally, for the Gradle plugin and the Gradle versions, I'd use the AGP Upgrade Assistant. And that brings us to the end of the video.